Hello everyone, I've got another video for y'all. Recently I've been trying to find a small piece of furniture that I can practice my stripping and staining on. I found this little table at a yard sale for $10. The top was really beat up and the legs had a pretty good amount of detail, so I figured this would be the perfect opportunity for me to practice my stripping and staining before I start some other larger projects. I haven't really stripped a lot of high detailed wood like this, so that's one thing I'm looking to take away from this experience. You might notice the background music in this video. Unfortunately, while I was recording this video, my phone, which I record off of, bit the dust. I waited to get a new one and started recording again, but the audio was just so different. I decided to get rid of all of the background noise and record some voiceovers with some background music. So bear with me, my upcoming videos will go back to normal with the sounds of the shop and all that. The first thing I'm gonna do to get started is take this whole thing apart. That way I can work on it one piece at a time. This was really easy to do because everything was screwed together with some old flathead screws. If you look at the writing on the bottom of this table, you can see that it was made in June of 1957. So again, the top has seen a lot of wear. It's chipping everywhere. It looks like the finish on the top is actually some sort of oil-based paint to be able to get these designs. The finish is chipping everywhere. It looks like someone tried to fill in some areas with some pencil and some red marker. Just for giggles, I used my sander to see how difficult it would be to sand this finish off rather than using stripper, but it was apparent it was going to take way too long, and with all this detail it was going to take even longer, so I decided to bust out the stripper. My favorite stripper to use is Clean Strip's Quick Strip. The 15-minute formula is the one you want to get. It's much faster than the 30-minute formula. Whenever I'm applying a stripper, I like to use a very liberal amount. You want to make sure that your stripper stays wet, that way it doesn't dry out too fast. I'll leave the stripper on for about 15 minutes and then come back and scrape it off. After I've scraped off all the stripper, I use mineral spirits to clean any leftover stripper residue. I do this by pouring mineral spirits onto the wood and then lightly scrubbing it with some coarse steel wool. After I remove the last of the stripper, I use some rags to wipe off the mineral spirits. It's important to get in all these grooves to make sure you get the stripper out of the cracks. Otherwise, whenever you go to apply your stain, it'll be uneven. At this point the wood's clean, but it's still very wet. It needs some time to dry, so I'll leave it alone for about 4 hours and then I'll come back to sand it. To sand it, I used a power sander with some 120 grit sandpaper. I'm going to sand it with the grain until all of the wood has the same tone. I like to use these mouse sanding pads to get detailed areas because they're real rigid and I can fold them to get into the areas that I need to. Now that the top is fully stripped, I'm ready to repeat the same process on the shelves. Since the grooves in these shelves were different from the top, I found it was easiest to use a toothpick broken in half and then just drag the toothpick along the grooves to get the leftover stripper out of the cracks. After the shelves dried, I repeated the same sanding process, starting with 120 grit sandpaper and finishing with 220 grit sandpaper. For the edges, I used a detail sander so I didn't have to worry about tearing them up with the larger sander. This was done with 220 grit sandpaper. For the legs, it was obvious I wasn't going to be able to use a power sander. This is something that I've never really done before, so I tried a few different options. The first thing I did was screw the legs into my little work table so that they would be sturdy. The first thing I used is this 3M no slip grip 180 grit sandpaper. I chose this because it has more of a plastic backing so it doesn't shred apart as easy. I started off by sanding the easier areas, and then I used the sandpaper to get into the grooves where I could. Just using this sandpaper, everything came off pretty easily, but I did want to explore some other options for getting into the grooves of these dowels. One of the first techniques I tried to use to get into the details of these legs was to use the sandpaper in sort of a shoe shining motion. This is one of the reasons that I chose this sandpaper, because I didn't want it to be ripping whenever I was trying to do this. This seemed to work out pretty well for this area of the legs, but there were some other parts of the legs where this wouldn't be an option. One technique I've heard about is using coarse grade steel wool to create a sort of braided string so that you can use the same sort of shoe shining motion to be able to get the detailed areas of these dowels. To do this, I unfolded the steel wool, separated a small portion from the side, then I twisted that portion with my hands until it made a sort of steel wool rope. Then I used the same shoe shining motion to be able to get into these curved edges that the sandpaper wouldn't have been able to get into as easily. The next portion of the legs presented another challenge. I decided to use some 120 grit sandpaper that was more rigid in hopes that it would take the finish off a little bit faster. It worked pretty good to get the finish off of the main areas, but the problem with this sandpaper is that it doesn't have a plastic backing, so whenever you bend it in half and try to get into the little creases, it has a little split and doesn't really get much work done. After trying the 120 grit sandpaper out for a little bit, I decided to go back to the 180 grit sandpaper with the plastic backing. You can see when I fold it in half, it doesn't have the same crease that the other sandpaper had. This allowed me to get down in the grooves a lot easier, and while I thought having a more rigid sandpaper would make it easier to sand these areas, it actually turns out that having a more flexible sandpaper was a lot better. Here you can see that the 180 grit sandpaper with the plastic backing was able to bend a little bit more and there's no crease. If we take a look at the more rigid 120 grit sandpaper, you can see there's a crease down the middle. In the end, I ended up sticking with the 180 grit sandpaper that had the plastic backing. Next time I have a project like this, I'll definitely try out 120 grit sandpaper with the plastic backing to see if I can make some faster progress. For the last part of the leg, I had to deal with these detailed areas again. So I went back to a thin steel wool braided rope to be able to get the small details, and I used a larger braided steel wool rope to be able to get into the larger detailed areas. After I was done with the initial sanding on the legs, I came back with a 220 grit sanding sponge so I could get into all the details and smooth everything out. Now that everything is sanded, I'm ready to move on to staining. With this piece, I'm going to be using some Minwax pre-stained wood conditioner. This helps promote a uniform finish when it comes to staining. On some woods, if you skip this step, you might get a splotchy finish. So just to be safe, I applied this to the wood, let it soak in for about 10 minutes. Then I wiped it off and left it alone for about 30 minutes before I applied stain. I wanted this piece to be darker than its original finish, so I used Minwax's dark walnut oil-based stain. To apply this stain, I like to brush on a liberal amount. I'll let it sit for about 15 minutes and then I'll come back and wipe it off. Once the top was done and I was happy with the finish, I repeated the same process on the shelves and the legs to make sure that everything matched. To protect the finish of this table, I decided to go with an aerosol lacquer finish. I like to use these Minwax aerosol cans because the spray comes out in a really fine mist, and the tip also has a nozzle where you can spray either vertically or horizontally, which allows you to spray up and down or side to side without having to tilt the can. The key to using aerosol lacquer or any aerosol cans is to use thin coats. The thinner the better. For the first 3 coats, I'll apply a very fine misted coat. I'll come back and sand with some 320 grit sandpaper. Then I'll do a final thicker wet coat, which gives the final surface a nice smooth finish. Here's the first coat of lacquer being applied to the top of the table. Again, you can see I'm doing a fine misted coat. Here's the third coat of lacquer being applied. You can see that I'm applying a little bit more and the finish looks a little bit splotchy. After this coat, I'll use a 320 grit sanding sponge to knock all of that down and then do a final wet coat. Here's the final wet coat after it's applied. You can see after it dries, it has a very smooth finish with a beautiful sheen. With the legs and the top finished, all that's left for me to do is to repeat the same process on the shelves to get everything to match. You can see here on the final coat that it looks like it has some texture to it. This sometimes happens when I'm applying a final wet coat, but as long as there's not a lot of wind blowing and it's not too hot, everything will flatten out and it'll end up with a nice smooth finish. I let everything dry overnight and then I was ready to put everything back together. And here is the final result. It definitely was a lot more work than I was expecting, but I did learn a few new things. I'm glad I was able to test out a few different techniques and see which works best for me. I've got some other stripping projects that I have coming up that are going to be much bigger than this, so look forward to those videos. My next video will be a painting project, so if you've been waiting for that, I'll have another video for you in a couple weeks. Thank you very much for watching this video and sticking it out with my audio issues. Again, this is something I haven't done before. If you have any tips for me, let me know what you think about this project down in the comments too. If you haven't already subscribed to my channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button and hit the bell so you get notifications when I do put up new videos. If you're already subscribed to my channel, make sure you like this video and drop me a comment. I love reading your comments and replying to them. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see y'all again soon.